lacks the educational foundation for critical care. The words hung in the conference room like a stain. Dr. Marcus Sterling had just said them aloud, his voice dripping condescension, his audience a terrified mother and father sitting across from him with their 8-year-old son's chart open on the table. They didn't know Katie Rodriguez was standing 3 feet away, holding the boy's post-operative orders. They didn't know that this quiet nurse had caught an EKG abnormality at 2 in the morning that Sterling himself had missed for 6 hours. The laughter that would follow, that hadn't happened yet. But it was coming. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects as Katie walked into her 3rd week at Oak Creek Memorial in San Diego. The trauma bay smelled like stale coffee and antiseptic, with underneath it something metallic, the ghost of blood no amount of bleach could fully erase. Cold stainless steel gleamed under harsh white light. She moved through the corridors in scrubs that still felt new, her badge clipped to her hip, her hand steady as she checked ventilators and adjusted for drips. No one had noticed her yet. That was fine. That was good. People who noticed you asked questions, and Katie Rodriguez couldn't afford questions. 3 months. She had been here 3 months, and already the rhythms of the unit had become familiar in the way that muscle memory works, your body knowing what to do while your mind stayed somewhere else entirely. The nurses here were competent, mostly. The residents were hungry and sloppy in equal measure. The attending physicians were a hierarchy of competence that ranged from adequate to dangerous, and Sterling occupied a particular position in that spectrum where he was dangerous precisely because he was adequate enough that no one questioned him too hard. He had the kind of confidence that came from never having to prove anything to anyone who mattered. The faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket weighed almost nothing. Katie could feel it when she moved, a small scratchy presence against her ribs like a secret told to her own body. She had stitched it there herself 18 years ago, in a barracks in Helmand Province, using medical suture thread because that was all she had. The patch had been cut from a uniform that didn't belong to her anymore, a uniform that had belonged to someone who no longer existed in any official record. That person had a rank, a service number, a series of missions logged in classified files that would burn if anyone found them. The military had made sure of that. The military had made sure of Katie Rodriguez too, in her way, ordered her to disappear, told her to take a new name and a new life, to let the old one fade into the kind of permanent erasure that only the Pentagon could achieve. So she had. She had become a trauma nurse. She had become invisible. She had become very, very good at it. The morning Dr. Sterling called her into the conference room, she was supposed to be checking on the 8-year-old in bed 4. The boy had come in 4 days earlier with a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung from a skateboarding accident. Katie had been the one to recognize the cascade, the subtle change in his breathing pattern, the asymmetry in his chest rise. She had been the one to alert the attending before things deteriorated to the point where the boy would have needed emergent needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She had been the one to call it right, early, with enough time to spare that the parents could be told everything would be fine before their son's oxygen saturation started to drop. Sterling had read her notes. Sterling had signed off on her assessment. Sterling had, in the process, learned that there was a nurse on his unit who saw things he missed. He did not like this. The parents sat in the conference room looking exhausted the way all parents in hospitals look exhausted, like they had been wrung out and not quite reassembled. The mother had her hand on the boy's shoulder. The father was studying Sterling the way people study someone who has the power to save or harm what they love most. Sterling stood with his hands in his coat pockets, and when he saw Katie in the doorway, his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Ah, Rodriguez. Come in, come in." He gestured to a spot beside him, close enough that the parents had to look up at them both. Close enough that this became a performance. "I wanted to discuss your charting from the initial assessment. Specifically, your failure to note the differential diagnosis for atypical presentations." Katie stepped into the room. She did not cross her arms. She did not defend herself. She did one very small thing, she took one measured breath. "Your education background is nursing school, is that correct?" 3 years, community college. The mother's hand tightened on the boy's shoulder. The father's jaw moved. Sterling's voice had taken on that particular quality it had when he was building toward something, the way a musician tunes an instrument before the performance. Because in my experience, critical care requires a foundation that typically comes from a 4-year program, ideally with research components. The kind of pattern recognition you attempted here, identifying potential EKG abnormalities, that's frankly beyond the scope of what we ask nurses to do. I'm not sure where you got the idea. He paused, and in that pause was a universe of condescension, but in a facility like this, we rely on physician expertise for those assessments. Katie looked at the boy. The boy looked at her. He had good color. His respirations were even. His scar was healing clean. "Thank you for your input, doctor," she said. The words came out soft. The words came out even. The boy's chart is accurate as written. Sterling's smile widened. He had gotten what he wanted, her to speak up, to contradict him just enough that he could frame this as insubordination. Katie watched his eyes move to the parents, ready to watch them flinch, ready to let them absorb the idea that this nurse had overstepped, that their child's safety might have been compromised by her presumption. One tear escaped Katie's eye. Just one. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling, and then she looked back at the parents. "He's going to be fine," she said. "You can take him home tomorrow." She walked out of the conference room before Sterling could say anything else. Behind her, she heard him start to speak, heard him stop. The hallway stretched long and empty. The smell of antiseptic was stronger here, layered over the faint hint of blood from the trauma bay, the metallic copper scent that never fully left your clothes no matter how many times you washed them. She had 38 minutes left on her shift. She spent them checking on patients, updating charts, moving through the ward with a kind of quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible. No one approached her. No one made eye contact. It was possible no one had even been told about the conference room yet. It was also possible everyone already knew. The break room smelled like stale coffee and something else, something like the ghost of microwave popcorn from yesterday. Katie pushed open the door at 2 in the afternoon, and there were 6 people sitting at the table scattered through the space. She went to the coffee maker and poured a cup. The coffee was the color of rust. She sat down at the nearest table. Inside of 17 seconds, people started leaving. One nurse collected her lunch container. Another checked her phone like something urgent had just arrived. A resident stood up and stretched, said something about needing to check on a patient. A tech rinsed his cup and walked out without making a sound. Within 90 seconds, Katie was alone at the table with cold coffee in front of her. She did not move. She did not react. She sat perfectly still and drank the coffee anyway. That was when Sterling appeared in the doorway. She could feel his eyes on her before she looked up. He was leaning against the frame with his hands crossed over his chest, and on his face was a smile of such pure satisfaction that it told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about whether she had been right or wrong in the conference room. This was about power. This was about the demonstration of it, the proof that he could make a room empty by virtue of her presence in it. He watched her for a long moment, watching her not flinch, watching her keep drinking the cold terrible coffee, and then he smiled wider and walked away. Katie sat there for another 4 minutes. The fluorescent lights hummed and buzzed. The refrigerator in the corner clicked on with a sound like ice breaking. Somewhere in the hospital, an alarm was going off, one of the monitors in the cardiac unit, the kind of alert that meant something minor had shifted in someone's rhythm, something that the machines had registered but that the human body might never even know had happened. Machines noticed everything. Machines never missed a thing. Machines didn't care about hierarchy or fear or the small terrible power that came from making someone else invisible. Katie finished her coffee. She stood up. She walked back into the trauma bay, where there was work to do and patients who needed her hands to stay steady and her eyes to keep seeing what everyone else had trained themselves not to notice. She had no idea what was about to start. She had no idea, yet, that the quiet demonstration in the break room was only the beginning. That Sterling was already making phone calls. that he was already building his case, already weaponizing the institutional machinery of the hospital itself, already positioning himself to erase her before she could become any more of a threat to the order he depended on. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what she had seen, what she had survived, what kind of calm comes from having already stared down the worst that the world can do. But he was about to learn. By week 8, the pattern had calcified into something Dr. Sterling could control with surgical precision. He didn't need to raise his voice anymore. The damage was already done. Katie had become the kind of invisible that most people spend years cultivating, and he'd accomplished it in less than 2 months with nothing but selective silence and a carefully aimed word to the right people at the right time. The write-up appeared on the unit board at 6:11 a.m. on a Wednesday, printed in black ink on hospital letterhead, laminated and posted where every trauma nurse would see it during shift change. Protocol violation notice. Katie Rodriguez. The charges were specific, incomplete vital sign documentation on trauma case 4182, failure to notify physician of declining O2 saturation levels within acceptable parameters, and improper charting sequence on a mass transfusion protocol case. At the bottom, see it in red ink, hospital board members. And there, in the recipient's line, a name that made the oxygen in the room feel thin, Gerald Whitmore, board treasurer. Sterling's brother-in-law. A man who controlled hospital funding allocation decisions worth 8 figures annually. Katie read it once while pulling on her latex gloves. She read it again while verifying her med cart. She didn't touch the paper. Didn't take it down. Just absorbed each word the way a desert absorbs rain, without comment, without visible response. But someone noticed her hands. They were steady. Not the steady of someone at peace. The steady of someone who had operated under pressure so profound that a hospital bureaucracy couldn't register on the seismograph anymore. A young resident named Chen watched Katie's fingers move across the medication vials and thought about the stories that didn't add up. A trauma nurse with 3 months tenure who caught errors in attending physicians' orders. Who anticipated patient decompensation before the monitors screamed. Whose hands moved during codes the way Chen's hands only moved in his nightmares. He filed the thought away. People didn't always match their timelines. Morning huddle began at 7:13 a.m. in the conference room adjacent to trauma. Dr. Sterling stood at the head of the table, the write-up in his hands, reading it aloud with the deliberate enunciation of someone performing for an audience. Protocol violation notice, filed 6:42 a.m., against Katie Rodriguez. He paused, letting his eyes scan the room. This is, of course, not the first time we've had to address gaps in clinical judgment at this level. The trauma unit fell silent. 3 nurses, 1 surgical tech, 2 residents, and a nurse manager who suddenly found the table surface fascinating. Sterling continued, his voice dropping to the tone of a disappointed mentor. Patient safety is not negotiable. Neither is adherence to documentation standards that exist to protect both our patients and ourselves from liability. Another pause. Some people, he said, not looking at Katie, lack the educational foundation for the critical thinking required in trauma environments. And that's not a personal failing. It's just reality. Katie felt the words the way you feel a riptide, the pull of it, the specific physics of it, the exact mathematics of its intention. She'd been in rooms where bullets came through windows. She'd held a tourniquet on a 17-year-old's thigh while shrapnel screamed overhead. She'd made decisions that kept people breathing when the decision itself was impossible. But Sterling's version of humiliation was designed for hospitals, not battlefields. It was designed to corrode you 1 shift at a time. She took 1 measured breath. Then another. Sterling was still talking, something about competency metrics and continuing education requirements, when Katie stood. The movement was small and complete. Not angry. Not defensive. Just vertical. Her gloves were still on. Her badge hung at her hip. Her eyes met his directly, and in that moment, something shifted in the room's air pressure. The way it shifts when a door opens onto a different altitude entirely. I've saved lives in conditions you couldn't imagine, Katie said quietly. And I'll keep doing it here. Despite you. One tear escaped down her left cheek. She wiped it with the back of her right hand without breaking his gaze. Then she turned and walked out of the conference room with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that the world can do. Behind her, Sterling's face had gone the color of something bloodless. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system working overhead, that endless mechanical breath that hospitals never stop taking. He'd expected defensiveness. Tears. Apologies. Maybe an appeal to fairness. What he'd gotten instead was something that looked exactly like the absence of fear, and it infuriated him in a way his words could never quite reach. He picked up his phone before lunch. His first call was to Gerald Whitmore. His second was to a private investigator. By 2:38 p.m., Sterling had requested Katie's full personnel file, her employment history going back a decade, her references, and every credential verification the hospital had on file. He didn't frame it as a character attack. He framed it as due diligence. He framed it as a senior physician's concern about hiring practices and liability exposure. He was good at framing things. He made calls the way other people breathed, automatically, effectively, without needing to think too hard about the ethics. By 4:51 p.m., he knew something was wrong. The investigator had called back. Katie's references didn't answer. Not the first one, a supervisor at a clinic in Portland. Not the second, a nursing director at a facility outside Seattle. Not the third. Each number was disconnected. Each facility address didn't match the names he'd been given. It was like following a thread backward through fabric and finding that the entire thing had been cut before you got there. Sterling smiled. This was better. This was evidence of fraud. Falsified credentials. Claims to experience that didn't exist in any system he could access. He was going to make a call to the hospital board that would end her career before sunset. He didn't know that Katie kept her real history in a place no civilian database could touch. He didn't know that the Pentagon erases people the way other institutions fire them, completely, systematically, with the kind of thoroughness that makes a person disappear from every record except the ones that matter. He didn't know that the faded patch sewn inside her jacket lining, that small piece of fabric so worn the color had bleached nearly white, represented 20 years of service across 3 continents and 2 wars, and that the military unit embroidered on it still knew her name, still had her number, still checked on her the way units check on their own. Sterling was still assembling his evidence when the emergency alert sounded at 2:14 a.m., 72 hours later. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 4. GSW to the thorax. ETA 3 minutes. And what he didn't know yet was that everything he'd built toward destroying her was about to become irrelevant, because something far worse was about to walk through those doors. The ER doors exploded inward at 11:53 p.m. A man the size of a linebacker, blood soaking through his shirt in a spreading map of violence, screamed his brother's name into the fluorescent-lit chaos. His voice shattered the sterile quiet like a fist through glass. Security froze. The attending physician in Trauma Bay 3 locked himself in the medication room. 3 nurses scattered down the hallway like startled birds, their shoes clicking urgently against the tile. Katie Rodriguez was checking in full line on a stable post-op patient when the roar came through the walls. The attacker's fists found the computer terminal at the registration desk. The monitor exploded in a shower of sparks and plastic. He was screaming now, raw animal sound, demanding someone tell him where his brother was, where they'd taken him, was he alive, was he breathing? His eyes were wild. His hands were shaking. Blood, some of it his, some of it not, dripped onto the linoleum floor in deliberate drops that sounded like a metronome counting down. From the corridor, Katie heard the chaos escalate. More staff abandoning the trauma bays. An administrator's voice on the overhead paging for security backup. The sound of another piece of equipment crashing. The man was moving through the ER now, checking each room, his desperation turning physical. He would find his brother. Nothing was going to stop him. Katie set down her fob bag and walked toward the sound. Not toward the exits like everyone else. Not toward the locked medication room. Not toward the administrator's office. She walked directly into the ER proper, into the center of the storm where a 6'4" man with trauma written across his face was tearing through the department looking for someone to save. She did not run. The attacker saw her emerge from the hallway and his body language shifted. Predatory. Desperate. The kind of dangerous that comes when someone has nothing left to lose. He started toward her, and she did not step back. Did not reach for security. Did not call for help. She simply waited, her posture open, her hands visible, her breath steady. "I'm looking for my brother," the man said. His voice was breaking. "Marcus Torres. They brought him in about 20 minutes ago. Gunshot wound. I need to know if he's alive." Katie's voice changed. Something fundamental shifted in her throat. The timidity that had defined her last 3 months at Oak Creek Memorial, the quiet deference, the careful politeness, the way she'd absorbed Sterling's insults without flinching, evaporated. What emerged was the command voice she'd used on 18-year-old Marines bleeding out in the Sanjin Valley of Helmand Province, the voice that had kept fractured soldiers conscious during medevac flights, the voice that had ordered medics to move and be ready and hold steady while mortars fell like rain. "Marcus is in Trauma Bay 4, Katie said. Her words were precise. Each one landed with weight. "Your brother is critical but stable. The surgical team is working on him right now. And you need to come with me because you're bleeding, and I need to check you for other injuries." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The man stopped moving. His breathing began to slow. He looked at her for the first time, really looked at her, and something in her face, in her bearing, in the absolute certainty of her presence, told him this woman knew what she was doing. This woman had seen worse. This woman would not lie to him. "Is he going to make it?" the man asked. His voice was small now. The violence had burned off, leaving only fear underneath. "Triage protocol says his vitals are responding to initial intervention," Katie said. She was moving toward him now, her hands up but not threatening, her movements economical and calm. "Let me check you. Head to toe. We need to document your injuries before I tell you anything else." She was already assessing him without touching. The blood on his shirt was still warm, fresh. A laceration above his left eye, still bleeding slightly. Possible fracture on his right hand, swollen. But his pupils were tracking. His breathing was controlled. His speech was clear. He wasn't the medical emergency in this moment. He was just a brother who'd watched his sibling disappear into a trauma bay and had nowhere to put the terror except through his fists. Katie guided him to a treatment room. Her hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, someone for whom emergency was just another Tuesday. She sat him down and began checking the head wound, her touch gentle but professional. She was talking the whole time, her voice low and steady. "Tell me your name." "David. David Torres." "David, I'm going to clean this laceration. You're going to feel pressure. Your brother Marcus was conscious when he came in. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Conscious. That's good. That's very good." David nodded. His hands were shaking now, but not from rage. From relief. From the sound of someone who knew what she was doing saying the words he needed to hear. Katie worked efficiently. She cleaned the wound, assessed the fracture on his hand, likely a boxer's break from punching the terminal, not from the shooting, and took his vital signs. Blood pressure elevated from adrenaline but stable. Heart rate coming down. The crisis in his body was resolving because the crisis in his mind had found an anchor. A name. A prognosis. The simple, profound act of being heard. "You're going to sit here," Katie said, her voice still carrying that command tone. "A tech will bring you ice for your hand. You can watch the board above this station. When Marcus comes out of surgery, you'll know. First. I'll make sure you know first. You have my word." David looked at her and something shifted in his face. He nodded. He was no longer a threat. He was just a man in shock, waiting to hear if his brother would live. Katie stepped out of the room and immediately her composure changed back. The mask went back on. The timid nurse returned. But for those minutes in the ER, something else had surfaced. Something that moved like a combatant trained for the worst, something that spoke like someone accustomed to keeping men alive when the world was burning, something that had stood between a desperate attacker and an entire hospital staff and had simply walked into the fire without flinching. Security arrived 90 seconds too late. Found David Torres sitting quietly in a treatment room with ice on his hand, waiting for news about his brother, and a trauma nurse checking his bandages with the efficiency of someone who'd field-dressed wounds under fire. The security team looked confused. The ER staff looked confused. Dr. Sterling, who'd watched the entire exchange from behind the locked medication room door, looked something else entirely. He looked like someone who'd just watched a timid nurse do something that didn't fit any narrative he'd constructed about her. Something that suggested competence. Something that suggested experience. Something that suggested she might be capable of far more than breaking 4 protocols and lacking the educational foundation for critical care. But the moment passed. David's brother made it through surgery. Katie spent the rest of the night coordinating his post-operative care, her voice back to its careful politeness, her movements precise and competent but unremarkable. By morning shift change, the incident had already begun to fade into the routine trauma of a hospital that saw 3 gang shootings a week. What they didn't know was that muscle memory had taken over in those moments. What they didn't see was the way her hands had moved with the automaticity of someone who'd performed triage under sustained fire. What they didn't understand was that the voice she'd used, the one that had ordered David to sit and had told him his brother's vitals were stable, was the voice of someone accustomed to command. The voice of someone who'd spent 20 years being erased. Dr. Sterling, however, knew he'd seen something. And within the hour, he was on the phone with the hospital president, framing what he'd witnessed not as courage but as reckless protocol violation, not as competence but as dangerous assumption of authority beyond her scope of practice. He was already moving. Already activating the network that had protected him for 14 years. Already beginning to rebuild the narrative that would bury whatever she'd just revealed in that ER. But the seed had been planted. The question was already forming in the minds of the nurses who'd scattered and then looked back. The question that would become a problem. The question that would ultimately become irrelevant, because something far bigger than a hospital drama was about to learn that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez was still breathing. The blood-covered man hit the floor. 1 second he was screaming his brother's name, fists still clenched, rage still burning through his system like wildfire. The next second his legs gave out. Katie caught him before his head cracked against the tile, lowered him down with a steadiness that made her movements look rehearsed, clinical. She was already checking his pupils, his breathing, running her hands down his torso for concealed weapons while half the trauma unit watched from behind closed doors. From the medication room, Dr. Sterling observed. Locked behind triple reinforced glass, he watched Katie work with a precision that made his stomach clench. She never rushed. She never panicked. She simply moved from one necessary action to the next like she'd done this 1,000 times before. Which she had. But Sterling didn't know that. Sterling only knew that Katie Rodriguez had just commandeered a crisis, stabilized a violent patient, and made every other trauma response in that bay look pedestrian by comparison. The man's breathing steadied. His heart rate dropped from 142 to 98 in 90 seconds. Katie was still talking to him, voice low, saying things like "You're safe now and your brother's in good hands," while checking for lacerations and contusions with hands that had held far worse together in places far darker than San Diego. A nurse handed her gauze without being asked. Another brought saline. The choreography was seamless. Even the staff who'd fled moments earlier came back, drawn by the magnetic calm she exuded like a force field. Sterling watched this and felt something crystalline break inside him. Not his composure. His certainty. The certainty that came from knowing the hierarchy was unshakable, that his position was unchallenged, that fear kept everyone in their place. Katie had just neutralized a 280-pound threat with nothing but her voice and medical knowledge. She hadn't called security. Hadn't waited for backup. Hadn't frozen or screamed or run. She'd walked toward the danger like it was nothing. That was the moment Sterling decided she had to go. By the time the gang member was admitted to the ICU and stabilized, Sterling was already on his phone. He left the hospital at 11:22 p.m., walked to his car in the covered garage, sat in the driver's seat with both hands gripping the steering wheel, and made 4 calls in rapid succession. The first was to Thomas Blackwell, the hospital president. The second was to Patricia Chen, the chief medical officer. The third was to David Hartfield, the board member who happened to be Sterling's brother-in-law. The fourth was to someone who answered on the first ring and asked no questions. By 2:13 a.m., Sterling's narrative was locked in place. Katie Rodriguez had violated protocol for point 1, the trauma response hierarchy, by intervening in a security situation without waiting for proper authorization. She had escalated a dangerous situation instead of de-escalating it. She had put staff at risk by approaching the patient while he was in an agitated state. She had, in short, acted recklessly. That it had worked was irrelevant. That the patient was stable, that no one was hurt, that the alternative was watching a man bash his own skull into the tile floor was completely beside the point. Sterling had already reframed the story. Bravery became recklessness. Competence became insubordination. Saved lives became protocol violations. The administrative machinery moved fast once a board member pulled the lever. Katie was called into a brief meeting at 6:58 a.m. before her shift even technically started. No warning. No union rep, no explanation until she was sitting across from Blackwell and Chen with Sterling leaning against the wall behind them like a vulture perched on a fence. Hartfield was there too, checking his phone, waiting to hear how this would play out. Blackwell didn't make eye contact. Chen couldn't make eye contact. Hartfield didn't care. Sterling watched Katie's face with the intensity of someone waiting for a reaction he could weaponize. "Your actions last night were outside the scope of your role," Blackwell said. His voice had the texture of a man reading from a script written by someone else. "You initiated contact with a hostile patient without proper authorization. You put staff at risk. You violated our trauma response protocols." Katie sat motionless. One breath in. One breath out. No tears. No defense. No trembling. Just a woman listening to someone rewrite the story of her own heroism into something criminal. Security was en route, Chen added, not meeting her eyes. "Your intervention was not necessary." Katie waited 2 seconds. "Then, your brother's alive because of what I did." Blackwell flinched. Chen looked away. Sterling's mouth tightened into something that might have been satisfaction. "Regardless," Blackwell continued, "we're placing you on immediate administrative leave pending a formal investigation. You'll surrender your badge. You'll have no contact with patients, staff, or hospital property. This is effective immediately." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Katie stood up, unclipped her badge from her scrubs, and laid it on the desk in front of Blackwell. The metal face caught the fluorescent light. For a moment, nobody moved. "You're making a mistake," Sterling said. His voice was smooth, conversational, the kind of tone a man uses when he's already won. "But mistakes are what you made before you came to Oak Creek. Bad hiring decision brought you here. Protocol violations will be what finishes you here." Katie turned to face him. In that moment, something shifted. Not in her expression, her face remained a perfect blank slate, but in the air between them. Sterling felt it and took a small step back, which was all the response Katie needed. She turned and walked out of the office without another word. By 8:15 a.m., Sterling had already called every reference Katie had listed on her initial application. Every number disconnected. Every address a dead end. Every institution had no record of anyone by that name. It was like Katie Rodriguez had materialized out of thin air 3 months ago with perfect credentials and no verifiable past. Sterling took this to Blackwell at 9:33 a.m. falsified credentials, fraudulent employment application, potential identity fraud. He had documentation. He had phone records. He had proof that Katie had lied to get the job. By noon, the hospital's legal team was involved. By 1:22 p.m., Sterling was asking about filing a police report. The narrative was no longer about Katie's competence. It was about her dishonesty. It was about her deception. It was about the fact that nobody actually knew who she was. 3 days of silence followed. 3 days of Katie's phone going unanswered. 3 days of disconnection notices arriving in the mail. 3 days of watching her entire civilian life get dismantled by a man in an expensive suit who decided that a woman who could think for herself was a liability to his career. On the 4th day, Katie walked into the VA hospital in Balboa Park. Not for any emergency. Not for any crisis. For herself. She'd been having chest pains, probably stress, probably just the weight of the past 72 hours sitting on her sternum like a sandbag. The waiting room was full of men and women in various states of recovery, some in wheelchairs, some on crutches, some with the kind of damage that didn't show on the outside. Veterans. Her people. People she'd saved in places where the sand stuck to blood and the heat made everything smell like copper and diesel. She sat down and picked up a magazine from 2019 without reading it. A young man with a prosthetic right leg looked up from his phone. Stared at her face for 3 full seconds. Then his eyes went wide and his phone clattered to the floor. "Chief." His voice cracked on the word. "Chief Rodriguez." The magazine went still in Katie's hands. She didn't turn her head. But she knew. She'd saved this kid. He wasn't a kid anymore. He was a decorated Marine reconnaissance officer with a Purple Heart and a story that probably still gave him nightmares. In Helmand Province, 2004. A mortar round had come through the aid station roof. Shrapnel had taken his leg and his hearing in his left ear. Katie had thrown her body across his, shielded him from the second round, applied the tourniquet with hands that moved on their own, gotten him to surgical staging while rounds still whispered through the walls like angry insects. She hadn't seen him since. "You've got the wrong person," Katie said quietly. She picked the magazine back up. But the Marine was already standing, already moving toward her with the kind of determination that came from recognition that went bone deep. "Chief, it's me. Lieutenant Morrison. Helmand." The aid station. His voice was shaking. "I've been trying to find you for 20 years. We all have. You disappeared. The records got sealed. We thought maybe you were." Katie stood up. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm sorry about your leg, but I'm just a nurse. Just a nurse here for a checkup." But Morrison wasn't listening anymore. Because he'd pulled out his phone and was already calling someone. His voice got quieter, more urgent. "I found her. I'm at the VA. You need to get here. You need to get here now." He paused. "No, I'm serious. She's standing right in front of me. She looks exactly the same." Katie walked out of the waiting room without running. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she moved at a measured pace, the kind of pace that looked normal to anyone not specifically trained to recognize tactical movement. She made it as far as the parking garage before she heard the first rotor sound in the distance. The sky opened up then. Clouds that had been hanging over San Diego all morning finally released everything they'd been holding. Rain started as a drizzle and became a downpour within 60 seconds. The kind of rain that sounds like applause against pavement. Katie stood in the shadow of the garage entrance and listened to it and felt something she hadn't let herself feel since her last tour, the weight of invisible things finally becoming visible. Everything was about to change. Again. She sat in the VA waiting room among the ghosts of her own wars. The chairs were plastic, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of old bone. A magazine lay open on her lap, unread. The same magazines had sat in FOB Shank's medical tent, 19 years ago, pages curled from sweat and dust. That was when she heard the whisper. "Chief!" She looked up. A young Marine sat 3 chairs down, prosthetic leg extended, his phone forgotten in his lap. His face was scarred on the left side, burned scars, the kind that came from improvised explosive devices and the mercy of medics who knew how to rebuild what fire tried to destroy. His eyes were locked on hers. Young eyes. Old eyes. The eyes of someone who had seen the exact thing she had seen. The burn victim from Sanjin Valley. The 11-year-old boy she'd shielded with her own body when mortars hit the aid station. She'd covered his wounds with her jacket, whispered to him in Pashto, *, stay still, young one, I have you, *, while rounds tore through canvas and wood. He'd been bleeding from both legs. She'd applied tourniquets at 03 for 7 hours. Medevaced him at 0411. Never knew what happened after. Now he was decorated. Reconnaissance officer. Sitting 12 feet away in a VA hospital in San Diego. His voice cracked. Senior Chief. Katie didn't move. Didn't blink. She nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, the kind that held 18 years of silence and protocol and the Pentagon's explicit order, * you do not exist. You never served. If you surface, we will bury you deeper. *. The Marine's hand moved to his phone. He typed something. Then he stood, unsteady on the prosthetic, and limped toward her. Around them, other veterans watched, the old calculus of recognition, of knowing someone's story just by looking at their scars. It's really you, he whispered. Not here, Katie said. 1 sentence. That was all she could risk. But he was already calling someone. His voice was military precise. Sir, I've located her. Oak Creek Memorial. San Diego. Yes, sir. Confirmed visual. I'm sending the file now. The next 3 hours dissolved into bureaucratic unreality. Katie's VA appointment ended before it started. She sat in a parking lot waiting for something she couldn't name. Her phone, the civilian phone, the one nobody important had, stayed dark. But something else was moving. She could feel it in the air pressure change, the way the sky seemed to hold its breath. At 1847 hours, 2 MH-60M Black Hawks descended toward Oak Creek Memorial's parking lot like judgment. No announcement. No warning. Just the rotor wash shaking windows and the sound of 1,000 whispered conversations dying at once. Trauma unit staff froze mid-task. Monitors beeped into the sudden silence. On the 8th floor, in a hospital conference room painted institutional beige, Dr. Marcus Sterling was standing before the board of directors, presenting his case for Katie's permanent termination. He had prepared slides. He had printed documentation. He had the board's attention and the momentum of a man who'd spent 8 days systematically dismantling someone's existence. Clearly falsified credentials, Sterling was saying, his voice carrying the satisfied weight of a predator closing distance. No prior employment verification. No military background whatsoever. The woman is a fabrication. An accomplished liar who infiltrated this institution and... The door opened. A Navy SEAL commander walked in. 46 years old. Eyes the color of flint. Combat ribbons on his chest that Sterling couldn't read. Behind him, 2 operators in tactical gear. Then the young Marine from the VA hospital, now in dress blues, his prosthetic leg moving with mechanical precision. Dr. Sterling, the commander said. His voice was flat, the kind of flat that came from 23 years of giving orders that couldn't be questioned. We're here for Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez. Sterling's face, it was like watching someone experience a miniature death. His mouth worked. No sound came. The board members exchanged looks that meant they'd just realized they'd been playing a game they didn't understand. The young Marine stepped forward. His hand trembled, actual trembling, the kind that surprised everyone because nobody expected a decorated reconnaissance officer to lose his composure. He placed a folder on the conference table. When he spoke, his voice broke on every word. 3 Bronze Stars, he said. 2 purple hearts. He opened the folder. The commander took it without looking at it, as if he'd already memorized the contents 1,000 times. As if he'd carried them the way other men carried photographs of their children. Bronze Star. Combat Valor, 2003. The commander's voice remained flat, clinical. Bronze Star. Combat Leadership Under Fire, 2006. He turned the page. Bronze Star. Extraordinary Heroism, Helmand Province, 2008. A pause. Just enough silence for the words to settle in the room like a bullet finding bone. Purple Heart. Shrapnel Wounds, IED Strike, 2005. Another pause. Purple Heart. Gunshot Wound, Direct Fire, 2008. Sterling's color had gone beyond ash. Beyond the pale of a man losing an argument. This was the color of institutional power recognizing itself outmatched by something older and more absolute. And, the commander said, a Navy Cross. Classified Commendation. Signed by General James Mattis. He folded the file closed. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez held a collapsing aid station for 11 hours under sustained Taliban fire. She treated 43 wounded. 38 of them survived. She protected a child who is now sitting in this room. She requested no recognition, no medal ceremony, and no public acknowledgement of her service. Which is why the Pentagon honored her request. And which is why you are about to learn what it means to attack someone whose record is sealed at the highest levels of military command. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator running in the trauma bay 2 floors below. However, the commander continued, and his eyes moved to Sterling with the precision of a targeting system, what you did to her after. That is not sealed. That is a matter of federal investigation. The FBI would like a word about your attempt to delete security footage from March 22nd. The night she saved a life while you hid in a locked medication room. As if on cue, because military timing was always precise, 2 FBI agents entered from the adjacent waiting room. Badges on lanyards. The kind of presence that made hospital staff feel suddenly very aware of their own innocence or guilt. Right behind them walked the IT director, a man in his 50s with Vietnam-era tattoos on his forearms and the bearing of someone who had spent 40 years protecting other people's secrets. We have every frame, the IT director said quietly. Every single frame. Preserved, backed up, and already filed with federal prosecutors. He looked at Sterling. You made one mistake. You tried to delete evidence. And you tried to do it on a hospital network with a veteran in the server room who takes backup protocols very seriously. Sterling stood. Saturday. Stood again. His hands shook, actual shaking, the kind that came from watching your entire institutional advantage collapse in 30 seconds. He pointed at Katie. At the door. At the commander. His voice came out like a broken instrument. This is, she's, you can't just, each fragment more desperate than the last. I have a right to, there are protocols, I have the board's confidence, my brother-in-law is. Your brother-in-law, the FBI agent said without looking up from her phone, is being interviewed separately regarding potential fraud charges related to contract awarding. So you might want to focus on your own situation. Sterling's face turned the color of old blood. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The room watched him understand, truly understand, that every card he'd built his career on had been played by someone else and he'd lost. He'd been losing since Katie walked into Oak Creek Memorial 3 months ago, and he'd only now realized it. 2 weeks later, the hospital announced a formal investigation into systemic bullying and harassment within the trauma unit. The board voted unanimously to create a new protocol for military veteran hiring and veteran serving initiatives. Oak Creek Memorial would be adding a dedicated VA liaison. Full benefits. Educational partnerships with naval hospitals. Sterling resigned before they could fire him. 2 months after that, someone spotted him at a strip mall on the edge of Tucson. He was standing behind a folding table in the parking lot, the kind used for car washes and garage sales. His name tag read, Steve. He was selling supplemental insurance. When a customer called him doctor, his entire body flinched as if the word was a live wire. But Katie was no longer thinking about Sterling. She stood on the hospital rooftop in her dress blues. The uniform she hadn't worn since the night the Pentagon ordered her to disappear, to become invisible, to accept that her sacrifice would never be acknowledged. The fabric hung on her shoulders like a memory finally given weight again. Her hair was pulled back in the same tight bun she'd worn in Helmand. Her boots gleamed, a shine that took military precision to achieve, the kind of shine that said "I know the standards and I will meet them." Over her heart, pinned exactly where it belonged, was the faded unit patch she'd sewn into her jacket lining 17 years ago. Special Forces insignia. Gold and black. The words "de oppresso liber liberate the oppressed." She'd carried it next to her skin for 2 decades, a secret pinned to her chest, a record the Pentagon couldn't erase because it existed only in fabric and memory. The young Marine climbed through the roof access door. In full dress too. His prosthetic leg made a soft metallic sound against the concrete. He stood at attention. No words. Some things didn't need them. Katie looked out over San Diego. The city lights were starting to come on as the sun dropped toward the Pacific. She thought about the break room table where staff had abandoned her. She thought about the file Sterling had printed with his careful accusations. She thought about 1 week of hiding and 3 months of becoming someone small enough to fit into a hospital system that wanted her broken. Then she thought about all the time she'd been small. All the years she'd held her competence back, wrapped it in deference, given it away in service to people who didn't deserve it. "Welcome back, Senior Chief," the Marine whispered. Katie's hand moved to her chest, fingers brushing the patch. The trembling that came wasn't fear. It was restraint, the specific tremor of someone who had been ordered not to exist, finally accepting that she did. That she had always existed, whether the Pentagon acknowledged it or not. The hospital below glowed with its own small emergencies. People were being saved. People were being lost. The machinery of medicine continued without her for one last moment before she walked back into it, not as a nurse, not as an invisible medic carrying secrets, but as Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. Decorated. Visible. Finally, hers again. She descended the stairs in dress blues, and every staff member she passed did a double take. The trauma unit nurses came out of their stations. The respiratory therapists paused at the ventilator. They all recognized her now, not by her face or her competence, but by the uniform that said everything her silence had protected. The hospital director was waiting in the hallway. "Senior Chief Rodriguez," he said, and his voice carried something like apology. "We'd like to discuss your role moving forward. Director of Trauma Services. If you're interested. No pressure. We understand if you..." Katie looked at the pristine dress blues she was wearing, then down at the scrubs hanging on a hook in the staff room behind him. Without a word, she walked past him. She changed into the scrubs. Same blue, same fabric, same uniform that had cost her everything. But when she walked back into the trauma bay, she was walking as herself. A patient had just come in. Blunt abdominal trauma from an MVA. Multiple fractures. Blood loss. The kind of case that required someone who'd held bodies together under fire and then kept holding them together in the quiet. Katie didn't even look at the trauma board. Her hands were already moving, already assessing, already knowing what the next 4 hours would demand. She spoke to the attending, a different doctor, someone who'd been away during Sterling's reign, and there was nothing deferential in her voice. "Type and cross for 6 units. Level 1 activation. And someone get me the 7.0 endotracheal tube. This airway is compromised in 30 seconds." She worked for 14 hours straight. When she finished, when the patient was stable, transferred to ICU, his family standing in the waiting room crying because their father was going to walk again, she sat in the break room alone. Someone had left her a coffee. Still warm. A note beneath it, *welcome home*. She didn't write the note down. Didn't need to. She knew who had left it. The veteran IT director. The Marine reconnaissance officer. The SEAL commander who'd stood in that board meeting and made Sterling understand what it meant to challenge the wrong person. Katie picked up the coffee and held it, feeling its warmth against her palms. Outside the break room windows, the city of San Diego was moving into evening. Somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Sterling's office was being emptied. His degrees would be taken down. His name would be erased from the rotation like he'd tried to erase her. But Katie would remain. She'd always been meant to. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the weight of keeping herself together long enough to stand in the light again. And now she was standing. Have you ever been so invisible that you forgot you existed? Have you ever worn silence like armor, only to discover you'd been protecting the world instead of yourself? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes and memories of the war nobody will ever officially acknowledge they fought. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.